He was a man forged from ice, and empire his name, a currency of absolute power in the heart of London. She was a woman with nothing but a set of brushes and a silent, unyielding dignity that unnerved him. When Cassian Blackwood, the formidable Duke of Northampton, uttered the 7 words that would shatter her world, he believed he was merely excising an inconvenience from his perfectly ordered life. He had no idea he was cutting out his own heart. This is the story of a rejection so cold it burned a scar across high society, and a search so desperate it threatened to tear a nation apart for the one woman he swore was worthless. The air in Blackwood Manor was old and held smelling of beeswax, aging leather, and the weight of lineage. It was an atmosphere that sought to intimidate, to remind any visitor of their relative insignificance in the grand tapestry of the Blackwood name. For Rosalie Thorne, it was merely a challenge of light and shadow. She stood before her easel in the West Solarium, her charcoal stick dancing across the page, capturing the petulant pout of Lady Cordelia, the Duke's much younger sister. Rosalie was an artist of growing repute, known for capturing not just a likeness, but an essence. It was a skill that paid her modest rent and kept her hand stained with pigment, a reality far removed from the gilded cage she now worked in. She had been at the manor for a fortnight, and in that time she had seen its master only thrice. Duke Cassian Blackwood was less a man and more a presence. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, his dark eyes missing nothing, his handsome face a mask of aristocratic indifference. He was called the Ice Lord of St. James's Square, a man whose approval was a rare and precious commodity, and whose displeasure was a social death sentence. He had assessed Rosalie upon her arrival with a sweeping, dismissive glance that took in her mended gloves and the determined set of her jaw, and had not spoken a word to her since. But Rosalie felt his presence. She felt it in the way the servants scurried a little faster when his footsteps echoed in the marble halls, in the way his sister's chatter would cease the moment he entered a room. And she felt it now, a sudden drop in the temperature of the solarium that had nothing to do with the autumn chill outside. "Cordelia, you are fidgeting," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth as polished granite, and just as cold. His sister, a girl of 16, immediately stilled. "Brother, I did not see you." Evidently. His gaze flicked from his sister to the canvas, and then with palpable reluctance to Rosalie. For the first time their eyes met directly. His were the grey of a winter storm, and for a heart-stopping second, Rosalie felt utterly exposed, as if he could see every patch on her soul. She dipped her head in a gesture of respect, her fingers tightening on her charcoal. "Your Grace," she murmured. He gave a curt nod, his attention already elsewhere. "The portrait is taking an inordinate amount of time, Miss Thorne. Art requires patience." "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "As does your sister." A flicker of something annoyance, surprise crossed his features before being suppressed. Cordelia giggled quickly, stifling it when Cassian's gaze returned to her. He did not deign to respond to Rosalie. He simply turned and left the silence he left in his wake more profound than the one he had broken. Over the next week, their interactions remained brief and charged. He would appear without warning, observing her work with a critical eye that made every brushstroke feel like a trial. He never offered praise, only a penetrating silence that was somehow worse than any critique. Yet Rosalie found herself studying him as much as he studied her work. She saw the tension in his jaw, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes that spoke of immense responsibility. She saw a deep-seated loneliness he masked with arrogance. In her private sketchbook, hidden beneath her floorboards back in her modest London flat, She drew his face from memory, capturing the man beneath the ducal coronet. The commission was to conclude with a grand ball celebrating Cordelia's 17th birthday, where the finished portrait would be unveiled. It was the event of the season, and Blackwood Manor was transformed into a dazzling spectacle of crystal silk and shimmering jewels. Rosalie had intended to slip away after her work was displayed, but Cordelia had insisted she attend, even procuring a simple but elegant gown of deep blue velvet for her. Standing in a quiet alcove, Rosalie watched the vibrant swirl of the London elite. It was a world away from her own, a beautiful, merciless machine of whispers and alliances. She saw the Duke moving through the crowd, a dark star around which all other bodies orbited. Beside him, constantly touching his arm, was Lady Beatrice Croft, a diamond of the first water, with a smile as sharp as it was beautiful. She was everything Rosalie was not titled wealthy and secure. Later, as the orchestra played a waltz, Lord Gideon Hayes, the Duke's closest friend, and a man with a surprisingly warm smile approached her. "Miss Thorne, your portrait is the talk of the evening. You've captured Cordelia's spirit perfectly." "Thank you, my lord," Rosalie said, grateful for the kindness. They spoke for a few minutes about art and Italy, and his easy manner put her at ease. She didn't notice the cold gaze that had settled on them from across the room. She didn't see Lady Beatrice lean in and whisper something in the Duke's ear, her expression a perfect blend of concern and malice. Cassian felt a vain throb in his temple. He had spent the evening enduring fawning sycophants and ambitious mothers, his engagement to Beatrice a foregone conclusion, meant to merge two powerful families. All night, however, his eyes had been drawn to the quiet artist in the corner. He'd told himself it was irritation at her presence, at her quiet defiance. But when he saw her smiling at Gideon, a raw, possessive anger, unlike anything he had ever known, surged through him. Beatrice's words were poison perfectly chosen. "Such a shame," she murmured, her voice dripping with false pity. "She has talent, but her ambition is unseemly. The way she looks at you when she thinks no one is watching. And now, Gideon, one fears she is simply trying to secure a patron of any kind." The words landed on the fertile ground of his pride, his deeply ingrained duty to protect his name from scandal or opportunism. His family had been betrayed before by those seeking to use them. He would not allow it to happen again. He saw Rosalie not as a woman, but as a threat, a social climber of the most dangerous sort, one who hid her ambition behind a veneer of humble artistry. He crossed the ballroom, his path clearing before him, as if by royal decree. Gideon, seeing the look on his friend's face, excused himself with a worried glance at Rosalie. Cassian stopped before her. The music seemed to fade away. The air crackled. "Miss Thorne, your grace," she said, her smile faltering at the ice in his eyes. "My friend tells me you have enjoyed the evening," he began, his voice dangerously soft. "I trust my hospitality has been satisfactory." "It has been more than generous, your grace." "Good." He leaned in slightly, his proximity overwhelming. "Then you will understand that it is now at an end. I find your continued presence here inappropriate." Rosalie's blood ran cold. She could feel the eyes of nearby guests upon them. "I don't understand. Lady Cordelia invited me." "My sister is young and naive. She does not understand the nuances of a situation like this." His gaze swept over her simple gown with contempt. "You mistake a commission for an invitation into my world. You mistake common courtesy for personal interest. Let me be perfectly clear so there are no further misunderstandings." He straightened to his full imposing height, his voice rising just enough to be heard by those straining to listen. He delivered the words like a judge passing sentence. Do not presume to climb where you do not belong. My name is not for the likes of you to covet." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the humiliation sink in. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the way the color drained from her face, and a cruel part of him was satisfied. He had reasserted control. He had protected his world. "You are not worth my name." Each word was a physical blow. The whispers around them erupted. Rosalie stood frozen, the magnificent ballroom twisting into a monstrous display of scornful faces. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. Her dignity, the only armor she possessed, was cracking. Without a word, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high, even as she felt her entire world shattering into a million irreparable pieces. She did not run. She did not cry. She simply vanished from the ballroom and from his life. Cassian watched her go, a cold, hollow victory settling in his chest. He had done what was necessary. He had excised the threat. He returned to Beatrice's side, ignoring the troubled look on Gideon's face. He had protected the Blackwood name. It was all that mattered. In the days that followed the ball, a strange and unwelcome silence settled over Blackwood Manor. Cordelia's portrait was lauded a masterpiece of the form, yet the artist's name was spoken only in hushed, speculative whispers. The official story, subtly propagated by Lady Beatrice, was that Miss Thorne, overwhelmed by her sudden notoriety, had retired to the countryside. The more salacious gossip, fueled by those who had witnessed the Duke's public dismissal, painted her as a disgraced opportunist who had been put firmly in her place. Cassian Blackwood embraced the silence. He told himself it was peace, the restoration of order. He threw himself into his duties, managing his vast estates, sitting in the House of Lords, finalizing the marriage contracts with the Croft family. He was the master of his domain, his life a fortress of logic and control. Yet cracks were beginning to appear in the walls. He found himself walking through the West Solarium, now empty of its easel and the scent of turpentine. The light fell across the floor where she had stood, and an unfamiliar emptiness gnawed at him. He had expected to feel relief, but instead there was a void, an echo of an absence he refused to acknowledge. He would catch himself looking for a flash of dark hair in a crowd, or listening for a quiet, steady voice that spoke of art with a passion he had never known. His nights became restless. The image of her face at the ball, the shock, the deep hurt she tried so valiantly to conceal behind a mask of pride, was seared into his memory. He had intended to be cruel, but he had not anticipated the cruelty would rebound upon him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth that no amount of vintage port could wash away. Lady Beatrice, his intended, seemed to blossom in Rosalie's absence. She was a constant presence at his side, her laughter bright and brittle, her conversation a merry-go-round of society gossip and flattering remarks about his acumen. She was, by all accounts, the perfect Duchess. She was beautiful, well-connected, and utterly devoted to his status. "Darling, you seem distracted," she said one afternoon as they took tea in the drawing-room. She placed her delicate hand on his. "Is it the shipping investments? Father says the markets are volatile." "It is nothing," Cassian replied, withdrawing his hand to sip his tea. Her touch, which should have been comforting, felt cloying. He found himself comparing it to the memory of Rosalie's hands, strong, capable, stained with the honest work of her craft. The first significant crack in his certainty appeared a week later. He was in his study going through some of Cordelia's expenses when he came across the final payment invoice for the portrait. Beneath the formally requested amount in small, neat script was a note. "Please deduct 20% from the final fee. The bolt of velvet for the gown was an overly generous gift, and I cannot, in good conscience, accept both payment and such a lavish present." "Ah," Thorne. Cassian stared at the note. He had assumed she had designs on his fortune, on his name. He had believed Beatrice's insinuation that she was a climber. But this note, this was the act of an honest woman, a proud woman, a woman who would not be beholden to anyone, even for a simple dress. The 20% was a significant sum for someone of her means. It was a gesture of profound integrity, and it flew in the face of everything he had chosen to believe about her. He summoned Cordelia. His sister entered the study nervously, still wary of him after the events of the ball. The artist, Miss Thorne, he began his tone more subdued than usual. "Did you speak with her after that night?" Cordelia shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "She was gone before morning. She left a note for me, thanking me for the commission and wishing me a happy life." The girl's voice broke. "It was my fault, wasn't it? I insisted she attend. I never should have." "It was not your fault," Cassian said the words, feeling like ash in his mouth. "Did she ever speak of her family? Her ambitions?" "She spoke of her art," Cordelia replied, her chin trembling. "She said it was the only true thing she owned. She wanted to earn enough to one day travel to Florence to see the works of the great masters. She never spoke of marriage or titles. She said a gilded cage is still a cage." A gilded cage. The phrase snagged in his mind. Was that how she saw his world? He dismissed Cordelia and sat for a long time in his chair, the invoice clutched in his hand. The edifice of his self-righteousness was beginning to crumble. His friend Gideon Hayes provided the next blow. Gideon found him in his club, brooding over a glass of brandy. "You look like a man condemned," Gideon observed, settling into the leather chair opposite him. "I am merely pensive," Cassian bit out. "About your impending nuptials, or about the ghost you created." Gideon's gaze was direct. "I spoke with Miss Thorne at the ball, Cassian. She was intelligent, dignified. She was not the grasping creature you and Beatrice painted her to be." "You know nothing of it," Cassian snapped. "I know you. I know your pride. And I know you committed an act of public cruelty that was beneath you." Gideon said, his voice low but firm. "What I don't understand is why. It wasn't just about protecting your name. It was personal. Vicious." Cassian had no answer. He couldn't explain the illogical, consuming rage he'd felt seeing her with Gideon. He couldn't explain why the memory of her quiet dignity was a constant torment. He was the Duke of Northampton. He did not make mistakes. But the hollow feeling in his chest, a feeling that had been growing since the moment she walked out of that ballroom, suggested he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. The final piece of his delusion fell away when he found one of her preliminary sketches. It had fallen behind a credenza in the solarium. It was a simple charcoal study of his own face, done from memory. But it was a face he barely recognized. She had not drawn the cold duke, the ice lord of society. She had drawn the man beneath. She had captured the exhaustion, the weight of his duties, the profound loneliness in his eyes. It was a portrait of stunning, brutal honesty. It was a portrait of a man she had seen. And in that moment, looking at his own soul captured on a scrap of paper by a woman he had scorned, Cassian Blackwood understood. He had not dismissed a social climber. He had broken something rare and beautiful. He had savaged a woman who had seen past his title to the man within, and he had done it for the worst of reasons, a pride built on fear and a jealousy he was too arrogant to name. The silence in his life was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of screaming regret. The discovery of the sketch acted as a key, unlocking a part of Cassian he had kept barricaded behind walls of duty and cynicism. The man in the drawing was vulnerable, weary, and desperately lonely. It was a truth he had never admitted even to himself, that Rosalie Thorne had not only seen it, but had rendered it with such empathy, shattered the villainous narrative he had constructed around her. He had called her worthless, but she had seen a worth in him he didn't know existed. His engagement to Lady Beatrice, once a strategic certainty, now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Her laughter grated on his nerves, her possessive touches felt like brands, and her constant chatter about society seemed utterly frivolous. He began to truly watch her, with the same discerning eye he usually reserved for business dealings, and what he saw unsettled him deeply. He saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes when a rival suffered a social setback. He heard the subtle, venomous digs she made at others always cloaked in the guise of concern. The need to know the truth of what had happened at the ball became an obsession. He started with the servants, questioning them discreetly. A footman, a young man named Thomas, nervously admitted to overhearing Lady Beatrice speaking with her friends before the Duke's confrontation with Rosalie. She was laughing, Your Grace. Thomas stammered, terrified of the Duke's reaction. She said Miss Thorne was a sentimental little nobody, and that it was time someone reminded her of her place. She said you, Your Grace, were the perfect instrument to do it. The perfect instrument. The words implied manipulation, that he had been a puppet in her social games. The cold anger that began to simmer in Cassian's blood was directed not at the footman, but at himself for his blindness. His next conversation was with Gideon. He found his friend at their shared fencing club White's on St. James's Street, and forwent any pleasantries. Gideon, I need you to be honest with me. What did Beatrice say to you about Miss Thorne? Gideon paused, lowering his foil. He looked at Cassian, his expression grim. She warned me away from her. Said the girl was clever, that she was using her artistic sensibilities to try and entrap a wealthy husband. She implied that Miss Thorne had a sullied reputation in her last place of employment. She made it sound like she was protecting me and you from a predator. And did you believe her? Cassian's voice was dangerously quiet. At first I had no reason not to, Gideon admitted. But after speaking with Miss Thorne, it didn't add up. There was no artifice in her. And after seeing what you did, I began to suspect Beatrice's motives were not nearly as pure as she pretended. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of deceit so callous it took his breath away. The final confirmation he needed, however, came from Beatrice's own hand. Cassian knew she kept a detailed daily diary. It was a point of pride for her, a chronicle of her glittering life. Gaining access to it felt like a violation, a dishonorable act, but Cassian was long past caring for honor. He needed the absolute truth, no matter the cost. Using his authority as her betrothed, he gained entry to her family's Mayfair home on the pretense of leaving a gift in her private sitting room. It took him less than 5 minutes to find the leather-bound volume with its gold-leafed initials B.C. His hands were trembling slightly as he opened it to the date of the ball. Her script was elegant, a series of perfect flowing loops that belied the ugliness of the words they formed. A resounding success. The entry began. The little dauber is gone, and the Duke is more mine than ever. It was ridiculously easy. He is so fiercely protective of that ridiculous name of his. All it took was a few well-placed whispers about her ambition, a suggestion that she was casting her net for poor Gideon, and his pride did the rest. The look on her face, when he cut her down, priceless. He delivered the lines I fed him almost verbatim. He thinks he is a lord of creation, but he is as predictable as any man. He sees a threat to his lineage, and he strikes. Now, with the artist pest removed, there will be no more distractions. He will be my Duke, and I shall be his Duchess. The wedding preparations can begin in earnest." Cassian had to read the passage 3 times before the full scope of the betrayal registered. The lines I fed him almost verbatim. His words, her venom. He was not a judge. He was a parrot, not a protector, a puppet. His public, devastating act of cruelty had not been his own. It had been orchestrated, scripted, and performed for the amusement of the woman who now wore his ring. He closed the diary, a terrifying calm descending upon him. The hollow ache in his chest had been replaced by a rage so pure and cold it felt like a shard of ice piercing his heart. He had not only wronged an innocent woman, he had done so at the behest of a monster, cloaked in silk and diamonds. He had allowed his pride and his prejudice to make him a fool. He did not wait. He did not plan. He strode directly from her home to his club, where he knew Beatrice and her mother were taking luncheon. He walked into the dining room, the diary held tightly in his hand. The room fell silent at the sight of his thunderous expression. He stopped at her table. Beatrice looked up, her smile radiant. "Cassian, darling, what a surprise." He said nothing. He simply opened the diary and placed it on the table in front of her, flipped open to the incriminating page. He watched as she read. He watched the color drain from her perfect face, her smile dissolving into a mask of horror. Her mother gasped, trying to snatch the book away, but Cassian placed a hand flat upon it. "Is this your handwriting, Lady Beatrice?" he asked, his voice resonating with a deadly quiet that carried throughout the silent room. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, her eyes wide with panic. "I believe this engagement is at an end," he said, his voice void of all emotion. He turned to the room of stunned onlookers. "My apologies for the interruption. It seems I have been operating under a grave misapprehension. I have allowed myself to be manipulated into an act of unforgivable cruelty against a woman of great talent and honor. An error," he stated, his gaze sweeping the room, "that I intend to spend the rest of my life rectifying." He turned and walked out of the club, leaving behind the ruins of Lady Beatrice Croft's reputation and the smouldering wreckage of his own pride. The truth had not set him free. It had imprisoned him in a new kind of hell, a hell of his own making. And he knew there was only one person in the world who could offer him absolution, the woman he had publicly destroyed. He had to find Rosalie Thorne. The dissolution of the engagement between Duke Cassian Blackwood and Lady Beatrice Croft sent a seismic shock through the ton. It was a scandal of the highest order, and Cassian, for the first time in his life, found himself at its epicenter, the subject of relentless speculation. He cared for none of it. The whispers, the pointed looks, the letters from outraged relatives, it was all meaningless noise. His world had narrowed to a single all-consuming purpose, finding Rosalie. He began with the logical ducal approach. He dispatched agents to her last known address, a modest but clean boarding house in Bloomsbury. They returned with grim news. Miss Thorne had settled her accounts the morning after the ball, packed her few belongings, and left without a forwarding address. The landlady, a Mrs. Gable, was tight-lipped and protective. Her eyes filled with scorn when she heard who was asking. "A fine gentleman like you causing such trouble for a sweet girl like that," she'd sniffed at his agent. She left with a broken heart, she did. Said London had grown too cruel for her. And who could blame her? Cassian's vast resources, which could bend markets and influence Parliament, proved maddeningly ineffective. Rosalie Thorne had simply vanished. She wasn't using her name, wasn't accessing the small bank account she held. It was as if she had dissolved into the city's fog. The search consumed him. He neglected his ducal duties, delegating them to horrified underlings. He spent his days coordinating with investigators' men from the newly formed detective division at Scotland Yard and private agents from the renowned agency of Mr. Jonathan Witcher. He spent his nights poring over maps, chasing down fragments of rumours, his study looking less like a nobleman's office and more like a campaign headquarters. His initial pride was stripped away layer by layer, replaced by a raw, gnawing desperation. He personally walked the grimy, cobbled streets of London's less savoury districts, places a duke would never be seen. He visited dingy art supply shops, showing Rosalie's sketch of him, asking if anyone had seen the artist. He was met with suspicion and silence. In this world, his title meant nothing. He was just another man with a haunted look in his eyes. Gideon stood by him, a steadfast anchor in the storm of Cassian's obsession. "You need to rest, Cassian," he urged one evening, finding the Duke gaunt and unshaven, staring at a map of England dotted with pins marking dead ends. "You will make yourself ill." "I am already ill," Gideon Cassian rasped his voice, hoarse from exhaustion. "It's a sickness of the soul. I can't rest. Every moment I do, I imagine her alone, struggling, because of me." The search expanded. He sent agents to every major port city, Liverpool, Bristol, Southampton, on the off chance she had fled the country. He had inquiries made at every coaching inn within a 100-mile radius of London. Weeks turned into months. Autumn bled into a bleak, bitter winter. London society moved on, finding new scandals to devour, but Cassian remained trapped in his self-made purgatory. He learned more about Rosalie in her absence than he ever had in her presence. He discovered she was an orphan, her parents, a country curate, and his wife having succumbed to influenza years ago. She had come to London with a small inheritance and a fierce determination to make her way on her own terms. She was known for her kindness, often sharing her meagre earnings with street urchins and giving free drawing lessons to children in her neighbourhood. Every new detail was another twist of the knife in his gut. He hadn't just humiliated an artist, he had savaged a woman of profound character and compassion. One particularly grim February evening, an agent brought news of a young woman, an artist fitting Rosalie's description, who had taken a room in a squalid tenement near the Thames. Cassian, refusing to wait, went himself his carriage, navigating the dangerous, unlit alleys of Wapping. He climbed the rotting stairs, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. He knocked on the door. It was opened by a frail, consumptive-looking girl who bore a passing resemblance to Rosalie, but her eyes were dull with sickness and laudanum. It wasn't her. The wave of disappointment was so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. As he left a purse of coins with the bewildered girl, the utter hopelessness of his task crashed down upon him. London had swallowed Rosalie whole. He was searching for a single grain of sand on an endless, desolate beach. He became a ghost in his own home, a spectre of the man he once was. The cold, arrogant Duke was gone, replaced by a haunted, obsessive man, driven by a single, desperate need for redemption. He had torn apart his own life, broken his engagement, alienated his peers, and poured a fortune into this search. He had told her she was not worth his name, but now he knew the truth without her. His name, his title, his entire world was worthless. He had torn his world apart to find her, and had found only emptiness. While the Duke of Northampton was tearing London apart, Rosalie Thorne was quietly putting herself back together, piece by painful piece. She had fled the city on the first morning, coach her destination chosen, with a pin dropped blindly on a map of England. The pin had landed on the rugged coast of Cornwall, near the small fishing village of Port Isaac. It felt as far from the gilded cage of London society as one could get. She had enough money from the first half of her commission to survive for a time. On her arrival, she gave a new name to the innkeeper, Evelyn Marsh. Rosalie Thorne, the artist, publicly shamed by a duke, was a person she needed to leave behind. Evelyn Marsh was a widow, she said, seeking quiet solace by the sea. The lie was simple and sad enough to quell most curiosity in the tight-knit community. The first few months were a blur of grief. Cassian's words echoed in the shriek of the gulls and the relentless crash of the waves. "You are not worth my name." She would walk for miles along the dramatic, windswept cliffs, the sea spray cold on her face, trying to scrub the memory of his contempt from her mind. She didn't touch a paintbrush or a piece of charcoal. The joy she had once found in capturing the world around her had been poisoned, tainted by the memory of what her art had cost her. But there was another, more urgent reason for her despair, a secret she carried with a mixture of terror and fierce protectiveness. A few weeks after the ball, she had realized the persistent weariness and nausea she'd been feeling were not merely symptoms of a broken heart. She was with child, Cassian's child, the result of a single shocking and deeply secret encounter. It had happened one rainy afternoon in the manor's library. She had been sketching the intricate woodwork when he found her. For once, his guard was down. They had spoken for over an hour, a real conversation about books, about duty, about the loneliness of his position. Something had passed between them, a spark of understanding, a flash of intense, forbidden attraction. It had led to a stolen, passionate kiss in the shadows of the towering bookshelves, a moment of madness that had escalated, leaving them both stunned and shaken. They never spoke of it again. For Cassian, it was clearly a momentary lapse to be forgotten. For Rosalie, it was a secret she now carried in her womb. The knowledge was both a burden and a strange, fierce comfort. It meant she could never go back, could never risk the Duke discovering the truth. He would think it a trap, the ultimate scheme of a social climber. He would try to take the child to raise it as a Blackwood and erase her from its life entirely. She would rather die. This child was hers, a part of her, not an heir to a cold and heartless legacy. This realization gave her a new strength. She was no longer just Rosalie, the broken artist. She was a mother. She rented a small, whitewashed cottage overlooking the harbour, its windows rattling in the sea wind. She forced herself to start sketching again, not faces, but the raw, untamed beauty of the Cornish coast, the jagged cliffs, the churning sea, the weathered faces of the fishermen. Her art became her salvation, a way to process her pain and build a new life for herself and her unborn baby. Her son was born in the spring with the help of the village midwife. She named him Arthur. He had her dark hair, but when he opened his eyes they were the colour of a winter storm, a startling, heart-wrenching grey. He was the living image of his father. Life as Evelyn Marsh was simple and hard. She sold her seascapes to a merchant in the nearby town of Padstow, who shipped them to galleries in Bath and London. The income was modest, but enough to support herself and Arthur. The villagers came to accept the quiet widow and her solemn, grey-eyed baby. They knew nothing of dukes or glittering ballrooms. Their lives were governed by the tides and the seasons. Here her worth was measured not by her name, but by her resilience and the quiet kindness she showed her neighbours. She found a fragile peace in this new existence. She loved her son with a ferocity that amazed her. He was her world. Yet at night, when the wind howled around her little cottage and Arthur slept soundly in his cradle, she would sometimes allow herself to think of Cassian. She did not remember the cold duke who had scorned her, but the man in the library, the man in her secret sketch, whose eyes held a world of loneliness. She wondered if he ever thought of her. She hoped for her own sake that he did not. Her new life was a delicate thing, built on a necessary lie. If he ever found her, he would destroy it all. A year passed. The frantic energy of Cassian's search had dwindled into a grim, methodical routine. Hope was a dying ember, choked by the ash of countless dead ends and false leads. He was a changed man. The sharp edges of his arrogance had been worn smooth by grief and exhaustion. He now moved with the weary weight of a man carrying an unbearable burden of regret. His vast fortune, once a source of power, felt like a mockery. He could buy anything he wanted, except the one thing he desperately needed, a second chance. He had offered a fortune as a reward for any information leading to Rosalie Thorne, an act that brought forth a deluge of charlatans and opportunists, each with a cruel, fabricated story that only deepened his despair. Gideon remained his only true confidant, watching his friend's slow disintegration with growing alarm. "This is destroying you," Cassian Gideon said one evening, finding him staring into the fire in his cavernous, silent study. "Perhaps it's time to accept that she does not want to be found." "I cannot," Cassian replied, his voice a low rasp. "To accept that is to accept that the damage I caused is permanent. It is to accept that I am beyond redemption. I cannot live with that." His obsession had a new focus. He began collecting art, frequenting every gallery and auction house in London, hoping to find a trace of her work. He bought any piece that even remotely resembled her style, his collection a testament to his desperation. His agents knew to scour even the smallest, most obscure provincial galleries. It was a fool's errand, but it was all he had left. And then, on a dreary Tuesday in late autumn, the miracle happened. Gideon burst into his study, his face flushed with an excitement Cassian hadn't seen in a year. In his hands, he held a small, unframed canvas. "I was at a small gallery off the Strand." Gideon explained, his words tumbling out. "A place that deals in provincial landscapes. I saw this." "Cassian, look." He placed the painting on the desk. It was a seascape, a stunningly rendered depiction of a rugged coastline under a stormy sky. The waves were captured with a visceral energy, the light on the water so real he could almost smell the salt. The artist had a remarkable talent, but it wasn't the skill that made Cassian's breath catch in his throat. In the bottom right corner there was a signature E. Marsh, but next to it, worked into the foam of a crashing wave so subtly that one would have to know to look for it, was a tiny stylized thorn vine. It was her private mark, a symbol he had only ever seen on her preliminary sketches at the manor. It was Rosalie. Cassian snatched the painting, his hands shaking. He stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. After a year of darkness, here was a single blinding pinprick of light. "E. Marsh," he breathed. She changed her name. "The gallery owner said he gets them from a merchant in Padstow in Cornwall," Gideon said, watching his friend with a mixture of relief and trepidation. "He says the artist is a reclusive widow who lives somewhere along the coast. Cornwall. A world away. A place of remote cliffs and wild seas, a perfect place to disappear. The lethargy that had held Cassian captive for months vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made him dizzy. He was no longer a man adrift. He was a man with a destination. "Ready my swiftest carriage." "Gideon," he commanded, his voice filled with a conviction that had been absent for a year. "Pack for a long journey. We leave at dawn, we?" Gideon asked, surprised. "Yes, we." Cassian said, turning to him, his grey eyes so long clouded with despair, now burning with a fierce, desperate light. You were her friend. She trusted you. She may not even open the door for me. I need you. He looked back at the painting, his fingers tracing the outline of the cliffs. He had told her she was worthless, and she had run to the edge of the world. He had spent a year tearing civilization apart to find her. He had searched the cities, the slums, the ports, but she had hidden herself in the one place he had never thought to look, in the raw, untamed beauty she had always loved to paint. He was coming for her, and he prayed with every fibre of his being that it wasn't too late. The journey to Cornwall was a torment of impatience. Every delay, every change of horses felt like an eternity. Cassian rode in a fever of anticipation and dread. What would he say? How could any words possibly bridge the chasm of pain he had created? What if she saw him and simply shut the door in his face? He knew he would deserve it. They reached the bustling fishing town of Padstow and quickly located the merchant who sold the paintings of E. Marsh. The man was wary of the two imposing gentlemen from London, but the weight of the Duke's purse was a powerful persuader. He gave them the location, a small isolated cottage on the cliffs overlooking the sea near the village of Port Isaac. As they navigated the final miles along the narrow, winding coastal road, the landscape from the painting unfolded before them. Cassian felt a sense of profound unreality. He was stepping out of his world and into hers. He instructed the carriage to wait at a distance, and he and Gideon proceeded on foot. They crested a hill and saw it, a tiny whitewashed cottage perched precariously close to the cliff's edge, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It looked both resilient and achingly vulnerable against the vast grey expanse of the sea and sky. Cassian's heart was in his throat. As they drew closer, he saw a woman outside, hanging washing on a line that bucked and snapped in the wind. Her back was to them. She wore a simple patched dress, her dark hair tied back, loosely strands of it whipping across her face in the sea breeze. Even from a distance, he knew it was her. And then he froze. A small child, a boy of about a year old with a shock of dark hair, toddled out of the cottage door and clung to her skirts. Rosalie turned laughing as she bent to scoop the child into her arms. The wind carried the sound of her laughter to him, a sound he had heard only once or twice and had never forgotten. Cassian felt the ground shift beneath his feet. A child? Her child. The dates aligned with terrifying, gut-wrenching precision. The boy had been conceived during that single stolen moment of madness in the library. He was a father. He had not only driven the woman he loved away, he had abandoned his own son. The enormity of his failure threatened to crush him. Gideon put a steadying hand on his arm. Cassian. Rosalie, alerted by the sound, or perhaps by some sixth sense, looked up. Her eyes widened. The laughter died on her lips, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly hardened into fear. She clutched the child to her chest, as if to shield him from a predator. This was the moment. He had imagined it 1,000 times, but the reality was 100 times more terrifying. He took a hesitant step forward. "Rosalie," he said, his voice raw, barely a whisper against the wind. "No." She breathed, taking a step back towards the cottage door. "You can't be here. You shouldn't have come." "Please," he begged, holding up his hands, as if to show he was unarmed. "Please just let me speak with you." Her eyes, full of a pain he had put there, darted from his face to Gideon's, and then back again. It was the sight of Gideon, a man who had shown her kindness, that seemed to prevent her from bolting the door. With a deep, shuddering breath, she nodded curtly and disappeared inside, leaving the door ajar. Cassian looked at Gideon, his face a mask of desperation. "Give us a moment," he pleaded. Gideon nodded, understanding, and remained outside. Cassian stepped over the threshold into the small, simple cottage. It was clean and sparse, dominated by an easel and the smell of turpentine and sea salt. Canvases were stacked against the walls, and in a small cradle near the hearth he saw a charcoal sketch. It was of the boy sleeping. Her art had survived. Rosalie stood on the other side of the room, the child still held tightly in her arms. The little boy stared at Cassian with wide, solemn eyes. His eyes. They were a perfect copy of his own. "What do you want, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice cold and formal, a shield against the torrent of emotion he saw in her gaze. He had rehearsed 1,000 speeches, but they all evaporated. Only the raw, unvarnished truth remained. "I came to beg for your forgiveness," he said, his voice cracking. "But I see now I have no right to ask for it. I didn't know about him." He gestured to the child, his heart aching. "Of course you didn't," she retorted, a flash of her old fire returning. "Why would you? I was a momentary diversion, an inconvenience to be discarded." "No," he said, taking another step closer. She flinched, and he stopped. "You were never that. Rosalie, I was a fool. A proud, blind, arrogant fool. I was poisoned by lies, but that is no excuse. The cruelty was mine. The words were mine. And I have spent every day for the past year living in a hell of my own creation because of them." He looked at her, at the strength in her face, at the fierce love with which she held their son. "I did not come here as a duke," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The Duke of Northampton is the man who hurt you. I left him in London. I came here as Cassian, the man from the library. The man you saw in your sketches, the one I didn't even know existed until you showed him to me." Tears were now streaming down his face, the first tears he had shed since childhood. He fell to his knees, all his pride, all his titles dissolving into nothing on the rough-hewn floor of her cottage. "I tore the world apart looking for you, only to find that the part of me that was missing was you. I don't deserve you, I know that, and I don't deserve him. But let me try to be worthy. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to earn back a fraction of what I threw away. Don't do it for me. Do it for him. Let me be a father to our son." Rosalie looked down at the broken man on the floor, this powerful duke brought to his knees, not by an enemy army, but by the weight of his own regret. She saw the truth of his suffering in his eyes. She looked at Arthur, at his son who deserved to know his father. The wall around her heart, built of pain and fear, began to crumble. She took a shaky breath. "Get up, Cassian." He looked up, hope warring with despair in his eyes. He slowly rose to his feet. She did not rush into his arms. There would be no easy absolution. The wounds were too deep. But for the first time in over a year, she didn't look at him with fear or hatred. She looked at him with a glimmer of the understanding she had shown him once before. "His name is Arthur," she said softly. You can hold him, if you'd like." It was not a declaration of love. It was not total forgiveness. But it was a beginning. It was a chance. As Cassian reached out with trembling hands to take his son for the first time under the watchful, weary, and endlessly beautiful eyes of the woman he had wronged, he knew that his frantic search was finally over. The real journey, the long, patient, and humble journey of earning his redemption, had just begun. The story of Cassian and Rosalie reminds us that our greatest mistakes can often lead to our most profound redemptions. It shows that true worth isn't found in a name or a title, but in the courage to admit when we are wrong, and the strength to fight for the love you almost lost forever. Their journey from the cold scorn of a London ballroom to the fragile hope on a Cornish cliff is a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness and the possibility of a second chance, no matter how badly the first one was broken. If their journey from heartbreak to healing moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who loves a tale of epic romance and hard-won salvation. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will capture your heart and stay with you long after they're over. Thank you for listening.